So I want to start this talk by asking you a question. What does beauty look like to you? What does it feel like? You see, I've had about, as Jean mentioned, 20 years of being in the trenches, being by the patient bedside, all types of patients, all types of cultures, as they embark on their aesthetic journey. And I want to share some of my paradigms and experiences and belief systems with you. And I know there's a number of industry professionals here as well, and some colleagues in my line of work, so I'm keen to hear your experiences in the Q&A afterwards. So my intention for the talk is to present a more complex and multifactorial perspective on beauty. And you may have some biases about this topic. We all do. There are some elements of beauty that are innate, as we'll get to. But even if you have those biases, it's important to at least recognize them. And hopefully, as the talk goes on, we'll introduce some other paradigms that may shape your experience of beauty more fully. So let's dive in. I wanted to start from an evolutionary perspective. You see, it seems, we've all heard the quotation, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But perhaps it's more accurate to say beauty is in the brain of the beholder. Because it seems that our nervous system, our brains, are almost wired to recognize certain facets of attractiveness and beauty. And they make this recognition extremely rapidly. Now, they could be calculating certain aspects of facial symmetry, facial proportion, shape, clarity of skin, all markers that not just in humans, but in nature, you know, symmetry is a sign of health. Whereas, let's say, disease or environmental stress often causes a lack of symmetry, as an example. Now, studies show, and what's really remarkable is that this recognition is made so fast, less than a second. Most studies show within 200 milliseconds, you can recognize if, let's say, a face it appeals to you or you find it attractive. Some studies even show within 30 milliseconds, you can start to accurately judge whether that face appeals to you as a beautiful face. So it's really remarkable. It's fast, it's almost subconscious, basically automatic. And the question is, why are our brains designed this way? What is the benefit of this fast recognition? So here we have to talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, and we got to talk about the beautiful peacock. You see, when Darwin was formulating his theories of natural selection, he was actually quite confounded by the peacock, or I should say the peacock's beautiful tail. He could not think of a single survival benefit to the peacock expending all this energy, all this resource to build this beautiful tail. In fact, the tail was making the peacock even smaller, even slower, and probably more at risk of being preyed on by a predator. So he had to refine his theory of natural selection, and he had to add a component of basically sexual selection. So he came up with this concept that, yes, this beautiful tail doesn't give the peacock any extra powers with the predator, but it's allowing the peacock to attract a beautiful female. And I'm sure a lot of you know, and you'll appreciate all the females in the audience, mostly in nature, it's actually the females that are choosing the mate, not the other way around. So it seems that there is a benefit from the perspective of fertility and the perspective of reproduction for our brains to have this innate ability to recognize attractiveness or beauty. Now, we're moving to a different maybe phase of the human existence. We're in a phase where it seems fertility or having kids is actually, in a way, a lot less important. Probably most of you have heard Elon Musk. He says that the biggest danger facing our species is actually reduction in population. A lot of people don't want to have kids, and they're not as focused in that element of propagation and passing on their DNA. So now the floor is open to other influences beyond evolution and beyond fertility to shape our perspective of beauty. These influences, you're all familiar with them. We live in the age where, everybody is an influencer, the entertainment industry, of course, and even my industry, the practice of cosmetic medicine, or maybe the business of cosmetic medicine, that's also influencing a lot of trends. It's basically like a dance. And so we're in a state where I want you to think about beauty not as a fixed set of attributes anymore, but as something a bit more fluid. And we know this because when we look at some trends from 20 years ago as a beauty standard, they're very different now. For example, lip volume and shape. I have a number of patients that have been blessed to have very beautiful volumized lips, but they always tell me, doctor, you know what? When I was growing up, my full-size lips was the thing that I hated the most because it wasn't in vogue back then. I have a patient that has probably the best jawline in the world, and I sometimes joke with her, we should post your picture as a after, exaggerate what we do, but it's just her own genetic tendency. And she said, 20 years ago in Toronto, she had gone to a plastic surgeon to try to get her jawline changed because she has this very strong, at that time maybe it was envisioned as a masculine jawline. Luckily she didn't do that. The time caught up to her. So beauty is fluid now. I'm still waiting for a scenario where maybe 15 pounds extra is a marker of beauty. I'm optimistic. So there is fluidity, there is this fluid nature to beauty, but at the same time, when we look at it at a specific time, it is somewhat static as well. So when we look at it, let's say today, fixed moment in time, there is also a universal aspect to beauty. And we know this because when they do studies, let's say comparing beauty pageant winners from across the globe, they are actually remarkably similar in terms of their facial shape, proportion, certain features, dimensions. So we also have this universal tendency around beauty. And these days it's very in vogue to talk about globalization in the context of trade and everything that's happening geopolitically with Trump. But there is also a type of globalization that's happening even in the beauty industry. It no longer matters which country you're from. If you want to chase that beautiful ideal, it can be a specific template and a specific set of features. So in this globalized context of beauty, we want to also acknowledge that there is a lot of competition. Some countries actually expend a lot of resources to be the influencers. One can argue that, let's say, a country like South Korea and their whole concept of K-beauty, in some ways it's overtaken even Hollywood, right? So there is this competition, or there's a lot of beauty trends that, let's say, originate from certain South American countries like Brazil, like Colombia. So it's globalized, but some countries seem to have a lot more power, and it's a race. It's a big, big, big race. So now I want to move into a little bit of a different perspective or paradigm. And I want to talk about actually an experience of beauty that's beyond just what we visualize. You see, one thing that I've noticed, and I'm saying this without exaggeration, is that some of the patients that I've witnessed over the last 20 years that make cosmetic enhancements, sometimes even cosmetic transformations, some of them also make a type of inner enhancement or inner transformation. It could be something as simple as they're just more grateful as an individual. So they're working on themselves. It's not just a cosmetic procedure. They're doing other things. Or maybe they're just laughing more, smiling more grateful. And those types of patients, I would argue, are the ones that enjoy a richer experience of beauty and the type of beauty that they reflect out. So when we look at the brain, there are three areas that activate in our experience of beauty. There is that immediate visual area. Then there is an area that is associated with reward and punishment, desire, want, excitement. But then there is a third area that actually gives meaning to our experiences. It gives meaning to our impressions of an image or even of a face. And it could be something like giving the meaning of, you know, if we pick up an aura, for lack of a better word, of someone's persona, being empathetic, being sympathetic, being in the present, having a big inner child, being joyous. So when those areas of the brain are activated in our interaction with someone else, I would argue that they become even more beautiful. So beauty is not just this visual thing, but it's also how you make people feel. Now, I want to take you maybe 7 years ago. My wife might recognize this story. She doesn't know about it yet, but we were in Las Vegas at a big cosmetic conference called the Aesthetic Show. It's a big, big conference. It's 7 a.m. I'm kind of jet lagged. I get into the elevator at the hotel. I forget which hotel it is. And there is someone in the elevator with a big grin, you know, face to face. And of course, me being from Toronto, in Toronto, we tend to be a bit cold. I'm kind of got a frown in my face. I haven't had my coffee. And I distinctly remember thinking, the nerve of this guy to smile like this at 7 a.m. in the morning, and he was just alone in the elevator. And it was just like, how's he doing this? So I go downstairs and I see, oh, he's a plastic surgeon and he's actually one of the speakers. Then I see the speaking item and I see that he's actually speaking about the art of smiling. And he's actually, yeah, he lives it. He's written a book about smiling. His name is Dr. Rich Castellano, and he's in Florida. Great guy. And I kind of became obsessed with his methodology because I saw him really living this. So all I'm saying is, you know, there are emotional attributes that also exemplify our experiences of beauty, and they can be as simple as a smile, okay? So studies show that you can improve your beauty by up to 30% simply by having a very genuine smile. But here's the kicker, it has to be genuine. Those same studies show that a forced smile or even a polite smile doesn't produce that 30% upgrade. So for it to be genuine, you gotta feel, you know, genuinely happy on the inside. That's what I mean, that, you know, in my experience, the patients that have done that inner work, they project a perhaps more everlasting version of beauty. So we've talked about the biological sequence, we've talked about the fluid nature, the universal nature as well. We've talked about emotional attributes of it, my favorite topic. And of course, one last influence on how we perceive beauty is the medical aesthetics industry itself, right? It's a big industry. I think it's like $200 billion plus and growing and growing and growing. And we couldn't have this talk that we're having 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago. The reason is that even the specialty of everything we do non-surgically was not available then. And this journey that's so accessible to patients now was not even accessible then. So the medical aesthetics industry itself, as a business, as an industry, it is also setting these influences on beauty. And sometimes, to be frank with you, there are issues within the industry. There is issues with practitioners that are not fully qualified or are poorly trained or don't have the licensure to do certain procedures. And sometimes there's a darker side to the industry. So there's a very positive side where you're helping people recognize their confidence, build their confidence, but there's also a darker side which can sometimes prey on an individual's vulnerabilities. And in an extreme case, taking advantage of individuals that have body dysmorphic disorder. We all know what happened with people like Michael Jackson, similar things. So the industry has two different sides. I've always believed in, of course, delivering aesthetics with a lot of empathy. So to wrap up, before we get to the Q&A and discussion with Jian, where do we go from here? We explored the concept of beauty through several different lenses. We discussed that our brains are wired to respond to certain physical cues, usually in a very, very fast and rapid way. It's innate. We discussed concepts like entertainment industry, cultural influences, other countries, K-beauty. And above all of that, we discussed the power of experiences and feelings and connection and how we make people feel. As a cosmetic physician, I've helped a lot of people achieve their aesthetic goals. And I've also witnessed that the ones that have the most amount of change are not the ones that just accomplished their ideal version of their jawline or lips or cheekbones, but they were people that also underwent a transition in how they show up in the world, how they connect with others, how they move, how they stand, how they dance. So in a world that often tells us what beauty should look like, I ask you to instead consider what beauty should feel like. And real beauty, in my experience of 20 years now, isn't just what we see, it's also how we show up in the world. So let's not just chase beauty, let's redefine it on our own terms and perhaps with a big, genuine smile. Thank you.
Dr. Amir Rouzati, another round of applause. Thank you. That was very interesting. I was furiously making notes of things things I could. First of all, just a disclaimer for some of the people in the crowd. We're friends. I know you. I like you. I believe in you. But I am a journalist. So if some of the questions, if somebody thinks, well, why are you being so tough on cuddly Amir? It's because I think you can handle it, and I think these are important questions to ask, right? So first of all, it's interesting. I was watching you give this talk, and I was reminded, I think you told me this at some point, as you were talking about cultural change. There's a cultural change around the perception of what you do too? Not the GP part, not the medical doctor,
Yes,
but you moved into cosmetic aesthetics, etc. And I think I remember you telling me that a few years back, you would go to a party, and if you saw a woman who was one of your patients, you wouldn't say hello in case she doesn't want you to say hello and find out that she's had the Dr. Rouzati, right? And I'm assuming that's not the case anymore. That because, I mean, I introduced you tonight as the Botox fillers guy, and nor should there be any shame around that, but nobody's kind of going, oh, really? Tell me about that evolution.
Well, I think it goes back to the what we discussed, like the access to these services. And to some extent, actually, someone who's sitting here tonight, I won't say who it is, but she mentioned something in the clinic a couple of weeks ago to me. And she said that, you know, luxury to her is fitness, being fit, and also her beauty or her skincare. So it is a form of luxury, and in the same way that we are not shy about, you know, showing a luxurious watch, or of course all the Iranians love their luxury cars, there's also a lack of shyness about these types of procedures because it can also be perceived as a form of luxury.
When did you first notice that change? Like, did you have a aha moment where you thought, oh, I'm not toxic anymore for being a Botox guy?
I would say in the last like 5-6 years in particular.
And how did you notice that?
Number one, a lot of like younger patients access it. So it's not just right now like looking younger, it's also, again, looking more beautiful, and beauty is power in some ways. Social media has a lot to do with it. And I think, again, just that access to everything just seems like all the barriers went down.
Okay. So let me walk through, or try and walk through, as I was making the notes about what you talked about tonight. You started by talking about biology, actually. You started by talking about, you said, beauty within milliseconds. You can look at someone, and people will look at someone and assess and feel they're beautiful. How universal is that? In other words, how much can culture override biology?
It's a good question. It seems that for faces, like face recognition, there is actually a lot of consistency in that reflex. But when we go into a little bit more like abstract versions of beauty, like looking at a artwork, then culture, your ambience, upbringing, other things come into play, and the consistency drops off. Because remember, we talked about like the beauty pageant winners, and we weren't prepared to, you know, have this be a slideshow deck, but there is a lot of slides that show there's a lot of consistency in the beauty pageant winner, irrespective of what country they're from.
But has that standard stayed the same throughout millennia? I mean, in other words, is there always, I mean, you made the case, and we'll talk about how it evolves, our standards of beauty. I always think about Fiddler on the Roof, you know, the musical Fiddler on the Roof, when he's singing If I Were a Rich Man, and he goes, if I were a rich man, I would have a wife with a proper double chin. In other words, having a double chin was something great in late 19th century Russia for the Jews, because that shows you're successful, you're prosperous, you know, and obviously that wouldn't be considered the same way now. But with that said, has there always been people throughout history, in other words, no matter, and now, no matter what cultural moments of the big booty or whatever we consider hot, that people would look at and go, that's beauty?
I would say that the concept has become much more, in some ways, globalized, as we talk about, maybe democratic and more universal now than in the past. I would say in the past, there would be a higher degree of cultural influence. Like, I'm sure in the crowd, people have seen, you know, pictures of, let's say, some of the Qajar princesses and these types of attributes, right? So they would have some attributes that may not be a beauty standard now. A lot of, yeah. So I think definitely historically there was a lot more cultural difference.
But the brain will always consider some things beautiful, is kind of what the case you were making.
Yes, yeah.
I have an issue with this universality thing because not an issue that we're moving towards a universal standard of beauty because everybody's starting to look the same.
Yep.
But isn't that a form of cultural colonization? I mean, how can it not be? And are we okay with that?
That's why we talked about this competition. You know, it's very valuable. I don't have the exact stats off the top of my head, but South Korea spends a lot of money for you to have a favorable view of their cosmetic industry. And they also hide a lot of, you know, crappy stuff that happens there. And they sometimes give rise to these, you know, trends that are not evidence-based, but then we live in this viral culture, unfortunately. There's competition for influence, but there does seem to be increasingly a global perspective around it. Now, there are some minor nuances.
Global perspective is a much kinder way of putting colonization. Are we celebrating diversity or not? On the face of it, we say we're celebrating diversity, but I think about going to Southeast Asia a few years ago, and I think anybody in Southeast Asia is beautiful. You know, the women from Thailand. But when I looked at the billboards, you know, the models who were on the billboards were Thai women whose faces were whiter, had made their faces whiter, exactly, who looked more Western. And Iranians are used to that too. You know, you're less likely to see the Sabze woman in the ads and that type of thing. And that's a bit sad to me, isn't it? That's not where we want to be going. And that's antithetical to this idea that we're celebrating diversity in a new age.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's different perspectives, but at the same time, Gian, we're also moving away from a type of world where, let's say, if you're blonde and blue eyes, and you're an actress, it's easy for you to get an acting gig. It's actually the reverse. You know, there is this kind of like reversion to the mean. So there is a universal template, but that universal template also has influences from across the world. And so I have some patients in my practice that are mixed in background, and some of them are actresses, and they actually say they have an easier time, you know, getting gigs than someone who has, let's say, a stereotypical blonde and blue-eyed, and they used to get gigs 15 years ago. So there is also a kind of a reversion to the meal. It's this to the middle, different attributes.
Just as a sidebar, when we're talking about beauty, how many people when we're talking about beauty are thinking about women rather than men? Almost everybody. But what you're talking about in terms of the way the brain perceives beauty doesn't only apply to women.
No,
right?
Of course not. No, I mean, when we talked about the fertility biases, for example, there's a lot of studies that show, you know, men that have, let's say, a square jaw associated with more testosterone, as an example, or a strong chin. And so,
what do they get?
Associated with higher testosterone level, and so more chance of being
What about a big nose? What are those? What's that associated?
You know, there is a Persian professor at Harvard, Azadeh, I forget her last name, but you know, she's again written a book about women with mustaches and men without beards in the Qajar dynasty of Iran. So I would say that the concept of beauty for men has existed historically as well.
Yeah, I wanted to throw that in there, but partly because we tend to, maybe in a lazy way, just think we're talking about women, but all of those stats that a man who's considered good looking is more likely to get hired than a man who isn't. Right. Like those things apply to dudes too.
Of course, yeah. A lot of times when I have men in the office, I consult with them and talk in a different language. So I'll say, look, you're a professional in such and such job. You know, there's emotional attributes to the face. And let's say if you're in a leadership position, I want your chin to portray that leadership position. So I talk to them in a different language than, let's say, just a pure beauty marker for a woman.
I thought the Darwin thing, survival, is fascinating. Yeah. That beauty is connected to survival. If that's the case, why would we celebrate any flaws or imperfections where we go, that's hot, look at the...
That's a kind of a next level talk, but in paradigms of beauty, there are certain features that could be considered ideal, but there's also a category for having like a one-off feature. Either it's like a standout feature, or it could be a slight flaw. As long as it's like kind of within balance, then it could be a beauty marker. So there are some rules around that too.
Beauty mark being the thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I was thinking that notion of symmetry, the facial symmetry, right? Cindy Crawford didn't have symmetry because she had a mole on one side, but that wasn't considered a problem, right?
Yeah, no. So there's always exceptions to the rule, of course. And that's what I said, that the industry sometimes can also have this dark side, like try to make everything a cookie stamp. I had a patient that came to me, and she was recently in Iran. She's a regular patient of mine. So A, she looks like a supermodel, but B, she had gone to a physician in Iran, and the physician, the first thing they said was like, oh, all I see when you walked in was your neck. And I was like, they consulted you like on a negative attribute, especially someone as beautiful as you. So what I'm saying is they sometimes do pick on a certain thing, the industry, that they really have no business picking on.
Sorry, what happened? She
Okay,
went
so-
and they said, all I see is your neck?
Yeah, as a
Because
negative attribute. So
she
this
had a
was a
bad neck?
flawless individual, but had a slightly, like let's say, flaw to the neck.
And who was saying that?
The physician in Iran who did the consultation. They kind of went straight for the negative
And how did
attribute.
that, and what she ended up doing? Getting her neck fixed?
No, she actually didn't. But it's this approach to delivering the aesthetic journey for patients with a positive viewpoint. So you always like accentuate the positive.
But that's one of the I mean, that's the thing, as well. When I was listening to you, I was thinking, well, who gets to be the arbiter?
Right.
Right. I mean, I know fashion magazine editors or
Who decides?
film directors. I mean, but you do as well, right? You're the arbiter. I mean, people are kind of putting themselves in your hands. You walk in with, I mean, maybe you don't do it. All I notice is your chin, your neck, but you might say, I mean, you've said to me, like, we could fix that chin, and I was like, what? Thankfully, I didn't get anything done, but I mean, why do you have that power? Why are you supposed to have that power?
Yes and no. I mean, your job is to, in any type of, let's say, even sales, consultancy, you're coaching the individual to like make a decision. And of course, they're there to rely on your expertise. But the distinction is that the floor is always open to the patient. So when the patient is there, they have the floor in terms of communication. It's not like that physician that said, oh, look at your neck, I want to fix that. You have to look at the patient in their entire ecosystem. So oftentimes I ask about what they do for work. I want to know what their community is. What are their goals? And then we come up with a treatment plan. So I'm not an arbiter.
Tell me about an experience where you were like, no, I'm not gonna go there. I don't want to do that.
Of a request?
Yeah.
That happens all the time. So one thing that I think is the marker of a standard in cosmetic medicine that should be very closely relied upon is actually, if I'm teaching someone, I tell them, the percentage of the time that you say no to a patient actually qualifies how good of a cosmetic physician you are. So that happens all the time. I'm proud to have a high percentage
give
of no.
an example of that.
It happens every day. Patient will come in. I'll give you a ready example. They'll come in. Oftentimes, a very typical encounter, somebody comes in and they says, I want lip augmentation. We take a look at the lip and I say, okay, the lip is like a beautiful painting, but the painting also can be in a beautiful frame. Let's start with the frame instead. It will make more of the end impact that you're after. Because sometimes individuals have the end impact in mind, but their path to get there is potentially incorrect. So I help them, I say no to the lip augmentation, and we do something else.
There's something that concerns me with what you do.
Yeah.
which is that I don't know if I made this term up, but
Okay.
if I did, I'll want to trademark it or something. Cosmetic enhancement inflation. So what I mean by that is, the more that people get these procedures done, the more pressure there is on others to get those. That becomes the new standard, and then everybody has to do. Well, now my lips look ridiculous. Look at how thick everybody else's lips are, so I have to do it, right? That worries me. I don't want to live in that.
But
world.
that applies to everything, doesn't it? These days, like all the pictures of everybody at the beach vacationing when it's like cold in Toronto, and it makes you feel like crap if someone else is away. We're constantly, unfortunately, doing those comparisons. It's not healthy. The industry does drive it, of course. But yes, give me examples of where that's not the case, even with, other things.
You're saying like keeping up with the Joneses, but we're talking about augmenting the way we look to, and there's an industry driving that.
Yes.
Your industry.
That's right. 200
Well,
billion,
I mean,
200 billion plus, yeah. I think, what you're talking about doesn't necessarily also reflect, again, that distinction of doing it with empathy and making that difference in
and ethics,
how that person walks, talks, the confidence.
But there's,
so yes,
there's
there's
only
a
so
fine
much
balance.
you can do.
Yes,
Dr. Rouzati
absolutely.
can be the most ethical guy, but if everyone else is putting in these crazy fillers, then you're going to be under pressure to do the same thing, right?
Potentially, as a practitioner, potentially, But again, it goes back to saying no, and
do you think that AI and what we are now seeing regularly on our screens is making the notion of natural beauty obsolete?
potentially. But what's interesting is, again, in some of these studies that look at the brain and the appreciation of beauty, if you give two objects, let's say, to a person, and you say, this one is a fake, that one is authentic, then the way they perceive, and even though they look identical, but they perceive the beauty of the authentic one differently. I've had in my waiting room video in the treatment room, like this beautiful vacation scene for the last week. And so patients, when they sit, they're like, oh my God, where is this? And then they look a little bit closer, and then they see that, you know, the stone that's like part of this ocean doesn't look real. It looks like AI. And then they lose their interest a little bit more. So I think AI is, of course, going to change this industry, like all industries, but our brains are cued to look for authenticity.
I mean, it's like the keeping up with the Jones thing again. I remember, I think I was talking to Paris or something, where we put up these pictures of me each week, and I was like, why does my face look so flawed? Like, look at these, and I was showing her all these other pictures. She said, this was like a year or two ago, and she was like, well, those people are using filters. Right. And I was like, well, why don't I use filters? Right? Like, you know, it was this like, and I mean, resistance is futile after a certain. It's like, well, I guess if I don't start using these filters, which I don't want to use, then I look like the flawed
That's
guy
right.
in the middle of all these perfect faces, and you know, it's like, what happened to this guy? Why does he look like this, right? So that's a tough one. That's a tough one because I'm personally not comfortable. I am one of those people who maybe this is getting old or something, but I walk into a room of young women now, and a lot of them look the same to me. Like, I'm like, what happened? Where I can't even. I meet someone, and I go, did I just meet you? Because everybody looks the same, and I think that's your fault as well.
This is, I would say, I don't know. In Canada, I don't have that perspective. But in certain countries, again, like, you know, our homeland, Iran, there's more of this phenomena. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I would say that everything within balance, of course.
Are you running for office?
Maybe.
What are these kind of answers?
Maybe it's the crowd you roll with.
Yeah, the Iranians. I mean, I'm going to ask one or two more questions and then open it up to you guys for some comments or questions. We'd love to hear from you. And I know there's some really interesting people in the crowd that I'd love to hear from and comment on anything we've talked about. If I could push back on one other thing, this hidden beauty thing.
Yes.
Come on. Your conclusion at the end of your talk was, by the way, I'm the guy making a lot of money injecting things so that you have less, the lines on your face. But it's all about hidden beauty and what's inside. It's really not, though.
I said it's dual. I said that the patients, and not all of them do this, the minority of patients that undergo both changes have, in my experience, a more holistic, actually, perspective around beauty. I mean, that's what I see.
But professionally, it's an unfair world, right? The people with a certain DNA have advantages over others.
Of course, that I'm not saying that everybody has that limitless potential. That's not what I said. It might surprise you. I mean, my wife doesn't know this actually, but when we met and people would ask me about her, I would often say that two attributes. She's like very present in real time, and also very like playful, like the inner child component. So for me, that was an aspect of beauty.
You didn't notice the way she looks. It was all.
In addition to that.
I couldn't even pick her out of a crowd. It's the inner beauty that came.
Yeah.
The wonderful Sammy. Well, I think that one thing that when you were saying the smiling has to be authentic, I get the smiling thing. When people smile, it feels you kind of is another way of saying it that, and this is also a tough one to come to terms with, especially since so many Iranians are so depressed all the time. But is it to say that people who are happy are more attractive?
I firmly believe that. Yeah, that was a component of my talk. I had a patient comes to my mind. She's, I think, of Hawaiian origin. And I haven't seen her for a bit of time now. But one time, I just got so amazed at just her aura. I had to ask her, how do you do this? You're sitting in front of me. I've known you for 10 years. I've never seen you come in anxious, depressed. And this was someone who had a normal life. She was not living in, Post Road or whatever. And then she said, Doctor, what you see and what you've observed comes with a lot of work. And so she said, I meditate, in her case, every day for an hour. Or she, told me some books that she reads. And she was embodying it, kind of like my mentor, Dr. Castellano. When I saw him in the elevator, the reason I became obsessed with him, I saw him kind of, live like that. So, yeah.
But, I mean, to be fair, we also live at a time when, at least in the West, when you're not supposed to smile at people too, that you don't know. That could be like
especially
a problem,
Toronto.
right?
Sometimes it's like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Let's open it up to any thoughts, questions. I'm going to ask Keon, why don't you come over here and help me. If somebody puts up their hand, just give them the microphone so that we can hear the question. Who would like to either a comment or a question? Don't be shy. Come on. Yes, over here. Keon, you want to
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk, first off. I have two questions, if that's okay. So the first one is the process that decides what's beautiful. When it talks about, you talked a lot about perceiving another person. Is it the same process that happens when we see a painting or nature, or is it a separate thing that happens in terms of deciding what's beautiful?
They're very, very similar in terms of my understanding of the areas of the brain that light up. However, with faces, as we discussed, it seems to have a little bit more reproducibility or universality, whereas when we look at a painting, then the cultural influences may play a larger role. But it's the same cues, and when they do the studies on this type of stuff, it's usually by the same methodology.
Awesome, thanks. And my second question is, in terms of what we're talking about when talking about the idea of the cultural impact.
Yes.
Are there any studies you can speak to that talk about post-operation satisfaction or happiness after the fact, like both long-term or short-term, that you could speak to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I'm in that realm of non-surgical cosmetics, so I don't have as much experience with cosmetic surgery, so I can't necessarily comment on that. But what I see long-term, many of the clients I've seen for 15, 20 years, I would argue that to me, their happiness level, confidence level, emotional well-being is much higher. In fact, we talked about trends. A relatively recent trend, Gian mentioned the overfilled face and all that stuff, but a relatively new trend is actually increasingly a merger between wellness and beauty. And again, we talked about that dance that the industry does with beauty. So now it's a little bit not in vogue to have the overfilled face. In fact, it's in vogue to talk about dissolving an overfilled face. That was always my approach anyhow, but now it's caught up maybe to the way that I've practiced all along. So there is a merger between wellness and aesthetics, and these two, it's a long-term story. So I would argue that with good patient selection, if things are being done ethically, I would argue that the long-term results should be fantastic.
Thank you again, guys. It was a great show. We appreciate it. My question is going to be a little bit negative side of the things, because we all talking about the positive things. I was reading this thing on Instagram, and it was saying suicide rate among the people who does operations, cosmetic surgery, is a lot higher than people who don't. Is it because they don't really like what they look after, or is it the confidence that they don't feel within themselves from the beginning, even before the operation?
Yeah, as we talked about, there can be some negative pitfalls in the industry. There is this common saying, I don't want to hoot my own horn, but after a while, if you're ever a patient at a cosmetic facility, look in the waiting room, because after a while, the waiting room starts to look similar because you start to attract similar type of patients. So without doubt, there are clinics that may operate on anyone, may not take the mental health into account, but it really should be taken into account at every opportunity, even for non-surgical procedures.
Back there,
Patient selection, always important.
question back there. I'll give this to Tina.
This question is coming from my lawyer. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Yeah, no, you're all good. I've been taking notes. You talked a little bit about when a patient comes in, how much you speak to them, and I know you teach young clinicians. So how much reconciliation do you have between maybe your perspective as a professional and a new patient that comes in, or a young clinician that comes in that has seen filters on Instagram and they kind of have a different perspective of what they should look like after? How do you kind of gauge that, and how do you either educate them or reconcile that?
How do I reconcile what's realistic or my view?
The difference between what your view is,
Yes.
doing this every single day, and somebody who's either new in the industry or somebody who's never had this and kind of comes in with an idea of what they think beauty is.
You're talking about the patient or
Yes.
another practitioner?
Either a patient or a young clinician that doesn't know what they're doing.
Comes back to doing your work with empathy, but I'm gonna choose the other clinician side of that. At times I was thinking, am I spending too much time figuring out about the patient's persona, what they do for work? Am I basically talking to them too much? So this was a question in my mind for a while, to be honest with you. And then I was at a conference, and I noticed another injector basically said, from the minute the patient walks in, they'll often go into the waiting room to see what the patient looks like in the waiting room. Then they'll, bring them into the room, and this really three-dimensional, almost obsession with understanding the patient. So then it made me feel more at comfort that my strategy is the right strategy to get a good feel for who they are, what their goals and aspirations are. And to answer your question, again, it comes back to a lot of saying no's. And if you're strong in saying no, I'm sure you do that in your legal practice too. You don't take any client, you say a lot of no's. I've observed that about you. So same concept, yeah. But it can be tricky.
When was it? Who's next? Any?
Great talk.
Thank you.
Thanks. Full disclaimer, I'm in the industry as a sales rep. So there's something called the golden proportion ratio. So it's 1 to 1.618, I believe.
Right, 5.
And that 5. So that's a universal sign in beauty that we see in logos, we see in art, we see in all ethnicities. So I think that's what the brain sees, is that ratio to see beauty across any ethnicity.
Right.
I think what this lady said right here, it's about confidence as well. So I often hear patients, they feel older on the outside than they do on the inside. So that's why they go and do these procedures. I look at people who color their hair. You know, where do you draw the line?
Right.
And to me, it's about instilling confidence for these people. And when you could do that, and you said the genuine smile, I think the genuine smile comes from the eyes.
Right.
So you can tell if someone's smiling genuinely through that.
Yes.
And in my experience, a job well done is almost like a guy who has a good hair transplant. You can't tell.
Right.
They look well rested. There's something different about them, but they're not overdone.
Yes.
And it's about that confidence.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to your comment is, you know, Gian at times was talking about going the extreme with certain things, but there is another version of extreme, and the extreme, a little bit along the lines of what you were saying, is when your face doesn't actually represent how you feel. I'll give you a quick example. I had a patient who was a great smiler, but because she had a lot of hollowness in certain areas of the face, her smile always looked like an anxious smile, because some people can smile due to feeling anxious. And when we corrected that area, the smile really, you know, resonated, and it no longer felt like or looked like an anxious smile. So it's not always forcing your face to give a different story. Sometimes you're doing procedures to basically look more like how you feel. And I think that's along the lines of what you were mentioning.
That's great. Yeah. And sometimes you want to do things really subtly. Nobody can tell that I put color in my hair, but I do.
Hi, Dr. Rouzati.
Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Good.
I just wanted to know, how young is too young, and have you had anyone at your clinic where you were just like, this is a child? Because as a mother of a daughter, and she's, I'm petrified when I hear her and watching social media, going through what she's going through at such a young age. And
It's a big problem.
and I know, I see on social media, the girls are getting younger and younger, and I'm baffled as A, how they afford it, and B, who's allowing it, and are these doctors actually legally obligated to say no at a certain age, or is it free for all? Since your lawyer's in the back.
I don't think it's a free-for-all, because you do have to take like age of consent into account. It's a very good point, because oftentimes, like, you know, a mom will come in and she'll say, even like their daughter, like early 20s, but she'll say, you know, my daughter is thinking about lip augmentation. I really don't want her to have it, that kind of thing. You're talking about people even younger than that. You have to be careful. You know, I don't have that type of patient population, but I can definitely appreciate some of the issues for sure. Yeah.
It was really invigorating in terms of some of the ideas that we talked about tonight, and the starts of conversations to have. Thank you for it's hard to do that kind of a sort of TED talk where you're, in 15, 20 minutes giving us the entire history of beauty, and you did it. I mean, you kind of weaved your way around from the biology to the cultural to the point we are right now in terms of augmentations and AI and all that. So very much appreciate it. Perhaps a final question.
Sure.
If you were to rewrite the rules of beauty now, what are the traits that you would elevate?
If I were to rewrite the rules of our industry,
What we
As a
consider
job?
beauty.
what we consider beauty, what would be the traits that I would elevate? I really love the direction the industry is going right now, and I alluded to it, that merging between wellness and beauty, wellness and rejuvenation. I love the fact that we're doing increasingly not volumizing procedures, but we're doing like stimulatory procedures. So I would rewrite the rules of the beauty to be more preventative, proactive, at the right age, of course, and really as the flip side of wellness.
I see none. Dr. Amir Rouzati, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, actually, keep clapping for a bit so we get in the recording. I shouldn't have cut.